The orc girl was left alone at the fair. The human took her hand and kept it. The fair never closed. That was the first thing Cade Rourke noticed when the drop shuttle broke atmosphere, and the station came into view through the forward glass. The lights. They burned orange and amber across the belly of Outpost Kethara like a city that hadn't been told it was dying. Market stalls. Vendor drones orbiting the upper deck in slow carousel. The sound of commerce threading up even through the hull, tinny and insistent, like the station didn't know 1,700 people had stopped responding to Alliance comms 8 weeks ago. Cade pressed his thumb against the cold porthole glass and watched the lights and said nothing. Sergeant Das leaned over his shoulder. Yeah. That's not what a dead station looks like. No, Cade said, it's not. The shuttle banked, and the full face of Kethara rotated into view. Hexagonal decks stacked 7 layers deep, each one a different species quarter, the lower human rings, the mid-deck Veth markets, and at the top, where the atmospheric mix ran thicker and the gravity pulled tighter, the orc sectors. Sector 8. Sector 9. The Cradle, they called it, the only remaining settlement of the Orc Vareth outside the Dominion's reach. Or it had been. Commander Yara Selek appeared at Cade's shoulder, her gray field jacket buttoned to the throat despite the shuttle's recycled warmth. She was the kind of officer who never looked cold even when she was, and never looked afraid even when she should be. Alliance lost contact 6 weeks ago, she said without being asked. Supply ships stopped docking. Their emergency beacon fired 48 hours back. Automated. She tapped the porthole. We have 5 days before the Dominion's next scheduled sweep of this sector. If there are survivors, we get them off before then or we leave without them. Nobody on the shuttle asked what happened to survivors the Dominion found. Cade turned away from the window. He was 31 years old, a field tech specialist attached to the Alliance's Rescue and Recovery Corps, and he had seen 3 stations go silent before this one. He knew the taxonomy of how things ended in space. He knew the particular silence of a hull breach, the different silence of a plague, the different silence still of something that had decided humans were the problem and had moved efficiently to correct it. He didn't know yet which silence this was. He was going to find out. The shuttle docked on the lower ring without resistance, the docking umbilical pressurized. The airlock cycled. Cade went through first with his scanner out, Das behind him, then Yara, then the rest of the 6-person team, a medic named Quan, 2 Marines named Pell and Toth, and their civilian interpreter, an elderly Veth linguist named Osha, who moved with the careful deliberation of someone who knew they had no business being here and had come anyway. The docking corridor was empty. They passed a food stall, shutters down, but the oil still warm in the fryers. A child's cloth toy on the floor, a rough-stitched approximation of a creature from some homeworld Cade couldn't identify. He stepped around it. The fair was still running. Not fully, not the way it had looked from the outside. The lights were on some automated cycle, vendors were absent from their stalls, but the structures were intact. The goods were still on the shelves. Somebody had left in a hurry, or nobody had left at all, which was a different and more troubling thing. They found the first body in the corridor between the market ring and the residential block. Not human, Orc Vareth, a female older, wearing the braided cord markers of a cradle elder. She had been dead perhaps 2 days. The cause was not immediately legible to Cade, but Quan crouched over her for a long moment, and when he stood his face was careful in a way faces get when the owner is deciding not to say the first thing that comes to mind. "What is it?" Yara asked. "I need to see more before I say," Quan said, which meant he already had a theory and the theory was bad. They moved deeper into the station. The fair's central hub, a circular chamber 2 decks high, with suspended bridges and hanging lantern drones still doing their slow rotation, was where Cade first saw her. She was sitting on the floor at the base of one of the market pillars, knees drawn up, a short blade held across her thighs with the flat of it resting against her forearms in a way that said she knew how to use it. She was Orc Vareth, young, perhaps 19 or 20 by Cade's reckoning of their aging, though Orc Vareth years compressed differently than human ones. Her skin was the gray-green of deep river stone, her eyes the amber of something old and largely done with being patient. She wore a torn Alliance surplus jacket over traditional cradle vestraps, the mismatched uniform of someone who'd survived by taking what worked and throwing the rest away. She looked at them the way a person looks at something they're still deciding is a threat. Cade lowered his scanner. He did it slowly, deliberately, the way you move around a frightened animal that has teeth. He took one step toward her. She had the blade up in under a second, arm extended, edge aimed at the space where his throat would be if he kept walking. He stopped. "We're from the Alliance," he said. "We're here for the SOS." She said nothing. Her amber eyes moved across the group, assessed Yara, dismissed the Marines, paused on OSHA, returned to Cade. "She may not have enough human tongue for that," OSHA said from behind him, already stepping forward to murmur something in the rolling, consonant-heavy cadence of Veth trade speech, which was as close to a common Orc Vareth dialect as they were likely to get. The girl Cade thought of her as the girl, though he would later learn she hated that, did not lower the blade. But something shifted in her face. The assessment became something more complicated. She said one word. OSHA translated it without hesitation. "Why?" Cade looked at the empty fare, the body in the corridor, the automated lanterns still doing their patient rotations in a station where almost everyone was gone. "Because you sent a signal," he said, "and because we came." She stared at him for a long moment, then she lowered the blade. Her name was Kale Varthresh, which in cradle naming meant approximately the child of the Thresh bloodline who had survived, though OSHA said the suffix var carried a weight in Orc Vareth that didn't translate neatly, something between survived and remained, the distinction being that remaining was a choice, and surviving sometimes wasn't. She had been at Cathara for 4 years, brought there by her grandmother when the Dominion's expansion had swallowed the Thresh homeland. She was one of 43 Orc Vareth still alive on the station. There had been 400 2 months ago. She told them this in a flat, unhurried voice, seated cross-legged on the floor of the fair while OSHA translated and Cade listened, and the rest of the team ran their equipment through the surrounding corridors. She held the knife in her lap the whole time, not as a threat, as a habit, Cade thought. The knife was what held her together. "The hunters came," she said through OSHA. "They always come, but these were different." "Different how?" Yara asked. Kale looked at Yara for a moment, then back at Cade. She answered Yara's question, but she aimed it at Cade, which he found interesting. "They wore faces," OSHA translated. "Orc faces. They wore faces and they sounded right and they smelled almost right and then they—" OSHA paused, parsing something in the translation. "The word she uses is unfold. They unfolded." Quan had come back to the main hub by then. He caught Cade's eye and made a small gesture, "Come here." Cade excused himself and followed the medic to a side corridor where Quan had set up his portable analysis rig over a second body. This one, a young Orc Vareth male. "Whatever killed the ones I've looked at," Quan said quietly, "did it from inside. The entry points are," he indicated the body with a controlled clinical gesture, "internal, from the chest cavity outward. Not a weapon, not a disease." "A machine," Cade said. "I think so, yes." Cade stood there in the corridor for a moment. He had downloaded the mission briefing on the transit, 2 months of silence from Cathara, 1 automated distress beacon, suspected Dominion action. The Dominion had its own weapons programs, its own arms contractors, its own long history of solving the Orc Vareth problem through the application of things that cut. But they'd never made anything like this before, not that the Alliance knew of. He went back to Kale. "Tell me about the ones that wore faces," he said. She looked at him for a long time. Then she began to speak, and OSHA translated in a low, even voice, and Cade listened with the particular quality of attention he reserved for things that were going to be important later. The hunters had arrived 3 months ago, she said. Not in ships, that was the first strange thing. They were simply there in the lower rings, moving through the market during a busy cycle when the noise and crowd would hide the sound of anything wrong. They looked like Orc-Vareth. They moved like Orc-Vareth. They passed through the cradle checkpoints because the checkpoint guards could not tell the difference, and the checkpoint guards were Orc-Vareth who had been looking at Orc-Vareth faces their whole lives. The first deaths happened at night. After the first week, the station knew something was wrong, but not what. After the second week, the fear had reached a pitch where the Orc-Vareth sectors had turned inward. Neighbors suspicious of neighbors, family members questioning family members. The impossible, corrosive paranoia of a community that could not identify the threat because the threat looked like them. By the time the humans and Veth on the station realized what was happening and tried to help, most of the Cradle's council was gone. The station's security forces were compromised. Communication relays had been cut. 1,700 people, and 6 weeks later there were 43 Orc-Vareth and 11 humans and 3 Veth survivors, all of them in the upper sectors, all of them waiting for a storm that Kale knew was coming, because she'd grown up learning to read the cycles of deep space, and she knew what the Dominion's sweep schedules looked like from the outside. She'd activated the beacon herself, from the comm bunker in the upper ring. She'd lost 2 people getting there, and she'd gotten the signal out, and she'd come back to the fair because the fair was the most defensible position she knew, and she'd been sitting there for 2 days waiting to find out if anyone was coming. And now Cade was here. "The ones that looked like your people," he said. "Are they still on the station?" Kale answered before OSHA finished the translation. One word. "Yes." He went back to Yara. The commander was in the fair's admin office, a cramped room above the main hub floor, running the intelligence they'd gathered through the team's tactical system. She didn't look up when Cade came in. "Autonomous hunters," he said, "Dominion-made, capable of biological impersonation. They're still active somewhere in the lower sectors." "I know," Yara said. "Pell found the factory." She turned the display toward him. The images were from Pell's helmet feed, a lowering maintenance corridor that had been converted into something else entirely. Assembly lines in the dark. Racks of dormant forms, each one the shape of an Orc-Vareth body, waiting. The smell in the helmet feed's audio was chemical and biological, in a combination that made Cade's stomach tighten. "How many?" he said. "Active, unknown, dormant, more than we can deal with." Cade looked at the images for a long time, the forms on the racks, the careful, ugly precision of the factory's construction. Someone had engineered this. Someone had spent years designing a thing that could kill a people by wearing their faces. This was not an opportunistic weapon. This was a program. "We need to move everyone to the upper decks," he said. "Consolidate the survivors. Find the fuel cells to get a transport powered up." "I'm open to that," Yara said. "If you can tell me how to move 43 Orc-Vareth and 14 humans through a station full of things that look like Orc-Vareth." Cade thought about Kale on the floor of the fair, blade across her knees, amber eyes doing their quiet arithmetic. "I think we have help," he said. Kale knew the station the way a person knows the place they've spent 4 years learning to survive in, not as a map, but as a body, the way you know your own house in the dark. She knew which corridors echoed and which absorbed sound. She knew where the maintenance shafts ran parallel to the main walkways, creating shadow paths through the station's structure. She knew the rhythms of the hunter patrols, because she had been watching them for 6 weeks while waiting for someone to answer her signal. She led them through the station in a way that was almost silent. Not actually silent, DOS was too big to be silent, and Pell had a weapon harness that clicked with each stride, but quiet in the specific way of someone who had learned the difference between sound and noise. She moved in short bursts between positions of cover, waited, listened, moved again. The team followed her lead without being told to. Cade stayed close to her. Not protectively. She would have found that insulting, and she would have been right too, but observationally. He was trying to understand how she saw the space around her, what information she was reading from the station's ambient signals that he was not. She stopped at a junction in the maintenance shaft and held up a fist. The team froze. Cade heard it a moment after she did. Footsteps in the corridor on the other side of the wall panel. The careful, evenly spaced footsteps of something that moved with mechanical consistency. Too regular. No human or Orc Vareth walked quite like that, with that metronomic, identical interval between each step. The alive had variability in them, even the most disciplined alive. These didn't. 2 sets of footsteps, they passed, they did not deviate. Kale waited until the sound had receded, then turned and looked at Cade. Something passed across her face that was not quite relief and not quite anything else he had words for. He gave her a small nod. She turned back and kept moving. They found the survivors in the upper ring sealed environmental module, a large pressurized compartment designed for atmospheric maintenance, repurposed by the Orc Vareth into a shelter. 41 of the 43 Kale had mentioned. 2 had been taken in the night before Cade's team arrived. She told them through OSHA, her voice flat with the flatness of someone who has run out of ways to grieve. She said it the way you say a thing you have said too many times, not without feeling, but with a kind of stripped-down economy of feeling, because the full version costs too much to spend every time. The survivors looked at the human team with the wariness of people who had watched everything they trusted become a threat. The children were the worst, not because they were more afraid than the adults, but because they were more honest about it. The adults managed their fear into other shapes. The children just looked. Cade crouched down in front of one of them, a small Orc Vareth child of perhaps 6, and he pulled off his scanner glove and held out his bare hand. The gesture was ridiculous. He knew it was ridiculous. He was a field tech with no training in Orc Vareth cultural communication, and no reason to think this would do anything except confuse a frightened child. The child looked at his hand, then looked up at his face. Then, slowly, with the profound gravity of a 6-year-old making a decision, reached out and pressed one small, gray-green hand against his palm. He felt Kale looking at him. He didn't look back. The operational problem was fuel. Cathara's transport bay had 3 functional shuttles, one of which was the team's own, which had capacity for 12. The other 2 were station-grade short-range transports, neither of which had been fueled in the chaos of the past 6 weeks. The station's main power grid had been partially disrupted, another piece of Dominion engineering, Cade suspected, cutting off the fuel transfer systems to strand the survivors. The fuel cells were in the lower ring. Of course they were. "I'll go," Cade said. "You'll go with a team," Yara said. "A team makes noise. One person who knows what they're doing can move through those maintenance shafts faster and quieter." "You don't know those shafts." Cade looked at Kale. Kale looked back at him. Something passed between them that was not a conversation exactly, but was perhaps the precursor to one. "She does," he said. OSHA translated. Kale said nothing for a moment. Then she said something that OSHA translated as, "I was wondering when you would finally ask me instead of talking about me." Cade had the grace to look briefly ashamed. "Fair point. Will you come?" She looked at him with those amber eyes, and he had the sense again of arithmetic being performed. The same calculation she'd been running since they'd found her, adding up the variables of him, coming up with a number she wasn't entirely sure she trusted yet. "Yes," she said. They went through the maintenance shafts in the near dark, Kale navigating by some combination of memory and the small hand marks she'd scratched into the shaft walls at junctions. A private map. made for herself. The kind of infrastructure you build when you know you're going to be alone for a long time, and you plan to stay alive anyway. Cade followed her marks with his fingers as they moved. A notch here, 3 scratches there. A circled dot, that meant. Cale explained through whispered OSHA translation in his earpiece. Junction, turn left, wait and listen. He couldn't read her language, but he could read her system, because her system was logical in the specific way of someone who had made it alone and had only their own rigorous mind to depend on. They talked, in the way people talk when they're moving in the dark, and the talking keeps the fear from taking up too much space. She told him about the Thresh homeland, the deep river valleys, the seasonal markets, the way Orc-Vareth communities organized themselves around the concept of Var, the remaining as choice, the decision to stay when staying was hard. She'd been 13 when the Dominion had come. She'd watched her grandmother make the choice to stay as long as possible, then the choice to leave when staying became impossible, and then the choice to come to Cathara, where there was a community, where there was something like the cradle, where the remaining as choice could mean something again. She said her grandmother had died in the 3rd week of the hunter's work, and she said it without the flatness she used for the others. Just said it plain, like a stone placed on a table. "I'm sorry," Cade said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, she would have liked this. The plan, moving through the walls like riverfish. She liked plans. Cade smiled in the dark. "Mine are usually worse." "This one is acceptable," Cale said, and OSHA's translation caught something at the edge of it that might have been dry, reluctant humor. They found the hunter's factory before they found the fuel cells. It was not in the maintenance level as Pell's footage had suggested, or rather, it had been, and had since expanded. The wall between the maintenance corridor and the lower cargo ring had been removed. The space merged into one large, low-ceiling chamber. The assembly lines were fully active now, not dormant. Forms in various stages of construction moved along the tracks, the biological substrate grafted to the mechanical core, the face assembled last, worked over with a precision that turned Cade's stomach precisely because of how accurate it was. How much someone had understood about Orc-Vareth physiology to build this. He took out his scanner and began recording, not because this was in the mission brief. It wasn't. Because this existed, and the Alliance did not know it existed, and the specific nature of what was being built here was information that needed to exist somewhere outside this station. Cale was crouched beside him in the shaft, looking through the grating at the factory floor. Her face was very still. "Cale," he said quietly. She turned to look at him. "I'm going to take this apart," he said. "Not the factory, I don't have the resources, but I'm going to take the system apart. The knowledge. Whatever's driving this, the architecture of it, I'm going to find it and download it, and when we get out of here, the Alliance is going to know what it is and what it does and how to stop it." He paused. "That's not nothing." She looked at him for a long moment. "No," she said through the earpiece, OSHA somewhere above relaying in the careful quiet of someone who understood they were translating more than words. "It isn't nothing." The fuel cells were in a secondary storage depot adjacent to the factory, a coincidence of station geography that now served the Dominion's purposes nicely. Controlled access, a reason for the hunters to patrol nearby. Cade moved through the depot carefully, running his scanner over the cell racks. The cells themselves were intact. The hunters had disrupted the transfer systems, not the storage. He could carry 6 cells in the pack he had. 6 was enough for both transports with careful rationing. He was pulling the second cell when he heard Cale's signal, a low, specific sound against the shaft wall, 3 short and 1 long, which they had established as stop now, do not move. He stopped, he did not move. Through the thin wall of the depot he heard footsteps, not the metronomic footsteps of a patrol. These were irregular, adaptive, the footsteps of something that was searching rather than routing, something that had detected a deviation in the pattern of the station's ambient signals and had come to investigate. He pressed himself against the cell rack and waited. The footsteps stopped outside the depot door. Cade breathed through his nose, slow and even, the way his training supervisor had once told him a person could reduce their heat signature enough to matter by staying calm. He'd never believed it. He believed it now, because believing it was the only productive thing available to him. The door did not open. After 30 seconds, an interval that felt architectural, structural, load-bearing, the footsteps moved on. He waited until Kale gave the clear signal. Then he pulled the remaining cells. They moved back through the station with the fuel cells and no further contact, which Cade found less reassuring than it should have been. The hunters had logic. They operated on patterns. The pattern had nearly found him once. It would revise. He tried not to think about the factory, the forms on the assembly line, the faces built last. Back in the environmental module, Yara had organized the survivors for transport with the quiet, precise efficiency that Cade had always found both admirable and slightly exhausting about her. She'd identified the most critical, the elderly, the children, those injured in the weeks of the hunters' work, and sequenced them for the first shuttle out. The second shuttle would carry the rest. Cade installed the first cells. The shuttle's systems came to life with the particular warmth of machinery that has been waiting. That was when Das found the children. Not children. 3 adolescent Orkvareth, 2 female and 1 male, chained to the wall of a maintenance alcove adjacent to the module. Arms stretched above them, bound at the wrists to brackets that had been welded to the wall. Alive, conscious, looking at the team with expressions that were at once frightened and something else, something slightly off, in a way Cade couldn't immediately name. "Cut them loose," Das said immediately. "Wait," Kale said. Everyone stopped. OSHA translated, but Kale had moved to put herself between Das and the 3 chained figures, her blade in her hand, and the translation was almost redundant. "Kale," Cade said carefully, "what is it?" She spoke in a low, rapid stream, not the considered speech she used when she knew it was going to be translated. OSHA's voice in Cade's ear was quieter, more careful. "She says she knows these 3, knew them, they were from the Thresh community. She says they were taken 4 weeks ago. She says they shouldn't still be alive." Cade looked at the 3 chained figures. The slight wrongness in their expressions resolved slowly, with the queasy resolution of an optical illusion that finally shows you what you should have seen from the start. They looked at him with patience, not the desperate, exhausted patience of people who have been chained to a wall for weeks. Something else. Something that was performing patience, in the way a system performs the behavior its architects intended. "Quan," Cade said. Quan already had his scanner out. He ran it over the 3 figures without approaching them. He looked at the results for a long moment, then at Cade. "Same internal configuration as the bodies in the corridors," he said, "but active, not dormant." Cade thought about what Kale had said. They shouldn't still be alive. He thought about the factory, the biological substrate grafted to the mechanical core. He thought about what kind of weapon is most effective when the people it's deployed against spend their energy protecting it. He thought about the children in the environmental module, trusting the humans because the humans had come when the signal fired, because the humans had lowered their scanners and held out their hands. "They're not Orkvareth anymore," he said. "No," Quan said. "But they look like it." "Precisely." Kale had not lowered her blade. She was looking at the 3 figures with an expression that Cade could not read except by its structure, the way something breaks and is immediately and absolutely controlled. He wanted to give her a moment. They didn't have one. "Kale," he said, "we have to handle this." She said one word. OSHA didn't translate it. He thought it might not need translation. They moved the three hunters with the electromagnetic disruptors Yara's team carried, standard issue for Dominion tech interference, never previously tested against biological mechanical hybrids, effective enough to matter. It was not clean work. It was not the kind of work that left you feeling like you'd done something precise and justified. It was the kind of work that leaves a weight on you that you carry at a slight angle afterward, always, because it doesn't settle into a comfortable place. Kale did not watch. She stood at the entrance to the maintenance alcove with her back to it and her blade in her hand, and Cade thought that the refusing to watch was its own kind of strength. When it was done, he came to stand beside her, not close, just present. She said something he didn't catch. He looked at Osha, who had come close enough to translate. She says, they would not have wanted to be what they had become. No, Cade said. They wouldn't. Kale looked at him then, directly, and whatever arithmetic she'd been running since the moment he'd lowered his scanner in the fair hub, whatever calculation she'd been performing on the data of him, he thought it might have reached a result. Not a conclusion exactly, but a number she was willing to use. They moved the survivors in 2 transports runs, the first wave out within the hour, the second loading when the hunters found them. Not by accident, by design. Cade understood it later. The pattern of the patrols had been revising all along, adapting to the data of intrusion, narrowing its prediction until the prediction was accurate. The factory had known someone had been in the depot, had known the deviation in the cell rack count, had been waiting for the moment the deviation was acted upon. They came through the lower corridor while Sexton was running the second transport's pre-launch sequence, and Cade was at the module entrance, helping the last of the survivors move toward the dock. A cluster of them, hunters in Orc-Vareth form, the wrong rhythm in their stride if you knew to listen for it, which Cade now did. Yara's voice on the comm, "Rurk, we need 30 seconds. He looked at the corridor, at the cluster moving through it, at the transport behind him with 11 survivors still boarding. He stepped into the corridor. It was not a considered decision. It was the decision of a body that has already done its thinking and has simply caught up to what it knew. He had his disruption emitter in one hand and his scanner in the other, and the scanner was already running a frequency analysis on the hunters because the frequency was their weakness. Dominion tech, Dominion architecture, the same resonant vulnerability he'd found in the factory schematics. The same thing he'd downloaded, the same thing that was going to matter. He walked toward them and he fired the emitter in a wide burst, and the frequency hit the first 3 and dropped them, not destroyed but disrupted, their internal systems screaming in that subsonic register that the original screamers had been named for, a sound that came up through the floor and lived in the back of the teeth. The remaining 2 kept coming. He fired again. The emitter was single-use and it had used. He had a sidearm, which was approximately as effective against Dominion hunters as a polite request. Something passed him in the corridor. Kale. She moved in the way she'd moved through the maintenance shafts, short bursts, positions of cover, but here there was no cover and she used the momentum of the corridor itself, the walls, the junctions, the way her body knew this space. She had the blade and she had something else in her offhand, a length of heavy cable she'd pulled from somewhere, wound twice around her knuckles. She did not fight them the way a soldier fights. She fought them the way a River Valley Orc-Vareth who had grown up learning where things were fragile fights, because the hunters were built to mimic Orc-Vareth bodies, and she knew every joint in an Orc-Vareth body that didn't handle lateral pressure well, and the hunters had not been built to account for someone who would treat the mimicry as a blueprint. It lasted 40 seconds, 2 hunters down, Kale standing in the corridor with her blade in her hand, and a cut along her left forearm from where one of them had gotten a retracted edge into her before she'd found its joint. She looked at the cut, made a sound that was not quite a word, then she turned and walked back toward the transport. Cade fell in beside her. He wanted to say something, Everything he thought of was inadequate. "The cable," he finally said. "Where did you get the cable?" "Maintenance shaft, Junction 4. I took it 3 weeks ago because I thought it might be useful." He looked at her. "You took cable from a junction 3 weeks ago because it might be useful." "I did not know what was coming," she said. "I tried to prepare for many things." He thought about her marks on the shaft walls, the map she'd built for one person, alone, in case she needed to survive, the beacon she'd activated herself, losing 2 people to do it, the blade she'd held across her knees in the fair for 2 days while she waited. "You're remarkable," he said. She looked at him sideways. OSHA translated something in her expression rather than her words, that she was not interested in being called remarkable by people who hadn't known her before the station went dark. Then she said something aloud. "She says I am ordinary, I am simply here." "I'm sorry," Cade said. "That's yes, fair." Something that might have been a very small smile passed across her face, brief and guarded, like light through a gap that immediately closed. They reached the transport. The launch was rough. Yara ran the pre-flight sequence in under 2 minutes while hunters moved into the dock behind them, and the transport hit the dock locks and cleared the umbilical with the specific violence of a vehicle that has been asked to move faster than its design intended. Cathara's lower ring fell away below them, the orange-amber lights still burning on the automated cycle, the fare still running in the empty station, marking nothing now. Cade stood at the transport's rear camera feed and watched it go. The survivors were crammed into every available space, seated on equipment lockers, standing in the corridors between seats, the children in the forward compartment where Pell and Toth had organized a loose watching arrangement that was less babysitting and more dignified solidarity. 43 Orc Vareth, 11 humans, 3 Veth, all of them alive, all of them out. He was aware of the factory, the dormant forms, the ones that had already left maybe, the ones built and deployed and now somewhere else, wearing faces no one would question. He had the schematics in his scanner. He had the frequency data. He had everything the Alliance needed to identify and counter the hunters wherever the Dominion had seeded them. That was the thing about Dominion thinking. It was thorough and it was patient, and it was exceptionally good at building systems for extermination. But it was not good at accounting for the specific variable of a human field tech and an Orc Vareth survivor who prepared cable in maintenance junctions for emergencies that hadn't arrived yet. It was not good at accounting for the person who remained when remaining was hard. Kale found him at the rear camera feed. She sat beside him in the way she sat, economical, contained, the blade put away now, her cut arm wrapped with Quan's field dressing. They watched Cathara recede together for a while. "The fare," she said eventually through OSHA, "it will still be running." "Yes," Cade said. "I used to," she stopped, started again. "On the first day of each cycle, my grandmother and I would go to the fair in the morning before the vendors came, before anyone, just to walk through it. She liked the early light." A pause. "She said it was the only time you could see the whole thing at once without people in the way." Cade thought about the empty stalls, the oil still warm in the fryers, the child's cloth toy on the floor. "We'll come back," he said. He didn't know if that was true. He thought it might be, if the schematics did what he believed they would do, if the Alliance acted on what he was bringing them, if the slow machinery of institutional response moved faster than the Dominion's next initiative. He said it anyway, because some things you say because they are true, and some things you say because saying them is part of how they become true. Kale looked at him. She looked at the camera feed. She said something. OSHA across the transport did not translate it. Cade looked over at him. OSHA met his eyes. "It's not, there isn't a good translation. In Orc Vareth there are words for different kinds of hope. What she used is the one for a hope that has been tested and damaged and continues anyway." Cade looked at Kale. She was still watching Cathara on the feed. a small point of orange-amber light now against the dark. He did not say anything. He sat beside her and watched the station go and thought about all the things that were going to need to happen, and all the work that lay ahead, and the weight of the schematics in his scanner, and the 43 people in this transport who were alive, because a girl had sat in an empty fare for 2 days with a knife on her knees and kept the signal running. After a while, without looking at him, she moved her hand across the bench between them, not reaching, not asking, just placing it there near his. He looked down at her hand, at his. He moved his hand to cover hers. She let him. Through the camera feed, Cathara's lights burned on in the dark. The fare never closed. It ran its automated cycle for a station that was empty now except for things that wore faces, and the lights turned and the lantern drones orbited, and the stalls stood ready for a market cycle that would not come, and none of that was resolved, and none of it was finished, and the work ahead was real and difficult, and the Dominion's patience was longer than any single human life. But the transport was full. And outside the window, in the direction the transport was heading, there was Earth. And between Earth and everything that wanted to end the Orkvarath, there was now a scanner full of schematics and a frequency that hit the right resonance, and a field tech who had been in the corridors and knew what he was dealing with, and beside him the person who had mapped the maintenance shafts and taken the cable and kept the lights on and remained when remaining was hard. The Dominion built things that were thorough. Humans brought people home. The 2-month transit was quiet. Not easy. 43 Orkvarath survivors, 11 humans, 3 Veth, and 1 transport not designed for this number of people for this length of time was a logistical exercise with no good answers. But quiet, in the way that things are quiet when the immediate danger has passed and the grief has not yet fully arrived, the specific stillness between. Kale spent the transit in the forward observation compartment for much of the time, learning English in the systematic, rapid way she apparently learned everything, by observation, categorization, and relentless application. She had some trade common already, which gave her a frame. She had Osha, who spent 2 hours each day in structured instruction with her, and who told Cade at the end of the first month that she was the fastest language learner he'd encountered in 40 years of interpretation work. "What do you expect?" Cade said. She mapped a station in her head in case she needed to survive alone indefinitely. "Yes," Osha said, and there was something in his tone that made Cade think the old Veth linguist had formed his own conclusions about Kale Varthresh, and was simply waiting to see if anyone else caught up. They talked, Cade and Kale, sometimes through Osha, sometimes in the hybrid communication of someone who had 6 weeks of English and someone who had 2 months of contact with a new language, and was going to use every word of it. The conversations were incomplete in the way all real conversations are incomplete, meaning transferred imperfectly across the gap between different kinds of minds and different kinds of experience. He told her about Earth. Not the geopolitical Earth, the institutional Earth, the Alliance and Dominion Earth. She knew enough about that to fill volumes. He told her about the parts that had kept him human-shaped after 3 years of recovery work in the worst stations the outer sectors had to offer. His grandmother's house in the Carpathian lowlands. The specific quality of autumn light on a river valley, which he mentioned without thinking and then thought about, because her homeland had been river valleys, and she was looking at him with something that was very controlled. "Similar," she said, in English, the word she'd clearly chosen for this. "Yeah," he said, "I think so." She told him things too. About the Thresh community's traditions of Var, the ways a community marked the choice to remain, the ceremonies, the specific vocabulary for different kinds of difficult commitment. She told him about her grandmother's archive, which she'd carried out of the Thresh homeland on a data chip the size of a thumbnail, and which was still in her vest wrap pocket, and which contained the oral history of 6 generations of her bloodline. She showed it to him. He held it in his palm, and tried to understand the weight of it. He gave it back carefully, with both hands. She noticed that. He could tell she noticed. When they reached Earth orbit, Cade filed his report before the transport finished its deceleration burn. The schematics, the frequency data, the full structural analysis of the hunters, their biological fabrication method, their communication protocols, their vulnerability parameters. 17 pages of technical documentation that the Alliance's Defense Research Division was going to find either fascinating or terrifying or both. He included a secondary document that he titled with deliberate plainness Human and Orc-Varath Survivors of Cathara Station. 40 names. 43 Orc-Varath, 11 humans, 3 Veth. Ages, origins, conditions, needs. Not a tactical asset. Not useful in the operational sense. Just a record of who had been there and had made it out and deserved to exist in Alliance documentation as people rather than a number in a recovery statistic. He filed it as a required addendum to the primary report, and noted that the primary report's operational value depended on the second-hand intelligence provided by multiple survivors, whose testimony was detailed and critical, and whose continued access to Alliance resources was accordingly recommended. It was the most paperwork-based act of defiance he'd committed in a career not short of them. Yara read the addendum over his shoulder. That's not standard format. No, he agreed. I'm not going to tell you to change it. I know. She left, he finished the report. Earth came up in the observation window, blue-white-brown, the familiar shapes of continents, the thin, bright line of the orbital ring, the lights of the upper stations. He'd been away 8 months, counting the transit there and back, and it looked the same as it always did, which was something he never stopped finding quietly amazing. Kale came to stand beside him. Earth, he said. She knew the word. She looked at it for a long time. He could not read her expression, not fully. He was still learning to read her expressions, which was a process he thought would take considerably longer than 2 months. She said something. He'd learned enough of her language to catch the shape of it, if not the content. He looked at Osha, who was in the corridor behind them. Osha said, she says, it is smaller than she expected. Cade looked at Earth. He thought about this. That's true, he said. It's smaller than it looks from the ground. She says that things which matter are often smaller than they appear. That is not a deficiency. That is how you can hold them. He looked at Kale. She was still looking at Earth. Yeah, he said, that's right. They docked 2 hours later. The survivors moved through processing with the combination of efficiency and visible strain that all arrival procedures carried. The institutional mechanisms of civilization trying to account for people in the honest, awkward way institutions manage, doing their best, and coming up short in all the ways that mattered most, getting across the line in the ways that were, at minimum, necessary. Cade walked Kale through it. Not because she couldn't navigate it alone. She was learning the landscape with the same systematic precision she applied to everything. But because there was a specific kind of disorientation that came from being processed as a survivor, as a statistic, as a category, and the antidote to that disorientation was simply someone beside you who knew who you were. She went through every checkpoint and answered every question, and looked at no one with deference. She looked at the Alliance intake officers with the amberite arithmetic that had started in the fair at Cathara and had been running ever since, and the intake officers, to their credit, mostly held up under it. At the last checkpoint, the senior officer checked her documentation and looked up and said, in the carefully neutral tone of institutional procedure, designation of arrival status, refugee, or authorized settler. Kale looked at the officer, looked at Cade. He held his hands open the way he'd held his hands at the scanner in the fair. Your answer. She turned back to the officer and said, in careful English, the word she'd picked. Remaining. The officer looked at the form. There was no box for remaining. There was refugee, and there was settler, and there was visitor, and there was several other categories developed by people who had not spent time in a station with the lights still running, and the survivors in the walls. "I'll note it as authorized settler with special circumstances," the officer said. "Note it as VAR," Kale said, still in English, still looking at the officer. "In my language, note the word." The officer paused, then typed it in. Cade did not say anything. He thought there was nothing useful he could add to that moment, and he had enough sense to know when to be quiet. Kale came out of the checkpoint and stood in the corridor of the processing center, with its institutional lighting and its wall of arrival screens. 42 Orc Vareth survivors and 11 humans, and 3 Veth somewhere behind her in the queue. And she looked at the ceiling for a moment with her blade hand hanging at her side, loose. And then she looked at Cade. "The fair," she said, still in English, "at Cathara. It will still be running." "Yes. When you come back," she said. And she put the emphasis on when the way a person puts emphasis when they have decided to use hope that has been tested and damaged and continues anyway in the form of a grammatical structure, when they are choosing to conjugate things in a tense that is more than optimistic. "When you come back, I would like to walk through the fair early, before anyone." He thought about the early light on an empty market, about a grandmother and a girl in the years before everything, about the specific quality of belonging that you carry in your body when you're somewhere that was home. "Me too," he said. He reached out his hand. She looked at it. She had looked at his hand before in the early days on Cathara, with the calculation running. She looked at it now with the calculation complete, the result in, the answer she'd been adding up to. She took it. Outside the processing center, the orbital ring hummed with traffic, and somewhere in the stacks the schematics were already moving through channels toward the people who would turn them into countermeasures. And the Dominion's patience was long, but it was not infinite, and the work was not finished, and none of it was finished. But in a corridor in a processing center on Earth, an Orc Vareth girl who had mapped the maintenance shafts of a dying station and kept the beacon running and sat alone in an empty fair for 2 days with a knife on her knees. She was here. She was standing. She had looked at a human's hand and she had taken it, and she was remaining, and it was a choice, and the choice was hers, and that was the whole of it. That was all of it. That was enough.